It started with a child's voice, quiet, soft, almost drowned out by the hum of background noise. The kind of voice that's easy to overlook unless you're really listening.
But what she said stopped everything.
One simple sentence from a 6-year-old girl not only turned the heads of police officers, but would soon unravel a case so disturbing, so bone-chilling, that even the most seasoned detectives would later admit they couldn't sleep for days. Now, I want you to stop scrolling, stop looking for the next video, and listen closely because this story will shake you to your core. You're here because you're curious, maybe even desperate to know what happened. And I promise you, by the time this is over, you'll not only have your answer, you'll never forget the moment you heard the truth. Before we dive in, let me ask you something. Have you ever witnessed something that didn't quite make sense, but you shrugged it off, thinking it wasn't your business? Maybe a strange look between two people, a child's fearful eyes, or something in a neighbor's house that just felt off. That's where this story begins. Not with blood, not with violence, but with discomfort.
Subtle, silent,
lingering. This case is a haunting example of how something deeply sinister can hide behind the most ordinary walls. How predators wear masks that look like loving parents, friendly neighbors, or even heroes in the community. And how it took the courage of a child, too young to understand the horror she lived in, to accidentally break the silence that so many others ignored. I'm going to take you through every chilling detail. But I'm not just telling you this story, I'm asking you to feel it. Imagine being the officer sitting across from a 6-year-old girl with pigtails and scuffed-up sneakers, hearing her talk about the room where the bad kids go. Imagine that first moment of confusion, quickly turning to dread as the realization creeps in that she's not playing pretend, that she's describing something real, something very real. As this story unfolds, you're going to meet people who failed her, people who tried to help her, and people who uncovered a truth so vile it made national headlines. But it didn't start there. It started with a routine visit, a welfare check. The kind police officers do every day. The kind that usually leads to nothing more than a knock on the door, a forced smile, and a report filed away. But this time was different. This time, they were met by a girl who shouldn't have answered the door alone, who looked malnourished, frightened, and far too aware of things no child should know. And when she opened her mouth and told the officer about the bad room, she said it like it was normal, like everyone had one. That was the moment it all began. And I want you to remember that moment, because it's the point of no return. Now, if you think you've heard stories like this before, think again. This isn't just about abuse or neglect. This is about a carefully constructed illusion, a suburban nightmare masked in smiles and school drop-offs. And the twist? It wasn't just one person behind it. It was a network, a system of secrecy, manipulation, and unspeakable acts hidden in plain sight. By the end of this story, you'll see how deep the rabbit hole goes, and trust me, it's far darker than anything you've seen in a movie or on another channel. Let's talk about the girl, whom we'll call Emily for privacy. Emily is smart, thoughtful, and had the kind of imagination that made adults laugh and marvel. But buried inside her innocence were glimpses of something darker. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for help. She just told stories. Stories about children who didn't listen and were taken to the other room. At first, investigators thought she was just confused, maybe influenced by scary movies or bedtime fears. But then she drew pictures. Pictures of cages, of locked doors, of faces that looked far too real to be fiction. And when forensic psychologists analyzed those drawings, they made a disturbing discovery. Emily wasn't inventing these things. She was remembering them. This is where things start to turn. The house Emily lived in looked normal, too normal. Manicured lawn, family photos, clean floors. But behind one false wall in the basement, police would uncover a secret chamber. A hidden space with no windows, no ventilation, and restraints on the walls. The smell hit them first. Then came the realization. This wasn't a forgotten storage room. It was a dungeon. Built with intent, built to imprison. But the true horror wasn't just the physical evidence, it was what they found on a collection of hard drives. Footage, diaries, documentation. Not just of Emily, but of others. I want you to stay with me here because what happens next is the most critical part of this case. And this is exactly why you're here. You want to know who could do something like this.
Why?
And how they thought they'd get away with it. You're about to meet the key players, people you love to hate. A father who preached about family values. A mother who volunteered at school events. A neighbor who heard the screams and said nothing. This isn't a story about monsters lurking in the dark. This is a story about monsters hiding in plain sight and the child who accidentally exposed them. Emily's words would eventually lead investigators across state lines, to victims in other towns, to accomplices living normal lives, completely unsuspected. Each clue was more grotesque than the last. But the psychological angle of this story is what makes it unforgettable. How does a child survive that kind of trauma and still smile? How do predators operate undetected for years? And why do so many people turn a blind eye until it's too late? I'm asking you to look deeper. Because this story isn't just about Emily. It's about the thousands of children who never get the chance to speak. The ones who are punished into silence. It's about the chilling reality that you can live next door to evil and never know it. Or worse, know it and ignore it. That's why I need you to stay until the end. Because by the time we finish the story, you won't just understand what happened. You'll see the signs for yourself. And maybe, just maybe, that knowledge could help save another child. Now take a deep breath. Because the next part of the story is where everything breaks wide open. Police thought they had it all figured out. A twisted father. A complicit mother. A hidden room. Case closed. But then, Emily mentioned a name. A name no one expected. Someone who wasn't even on the radar. And when detectives traced it, they found something that changed everything they thought they knew. A second house. Another child. And a secret even Emily didn't know existed. Emily's story might have started with a whisper, but what came next grew louder with each discovery, until it became impossible to ignore. As the detectives continued their investigation, the line between fact and fiction blurred in unsettling ways. Nothing about her background screamed tragedy. In fact, if you looked at the surface, it seemed like she was just another kid growing up in small-town America. The kind of town where folks wave from their porches, where kids ride their bikes until the streetlights flicker on, and where no one locks their doors because, according to them, nothing bad ever really happens here. Her mother, Teresa, ran a home-based baking business and was known for donating cookies during school fundraisers. To neighbors, they were kind, generous, always smiling. But in hindsight, those smiles were too perfect, too forced. When the police began digging into their lives, what they found didn't add up. Financial records were off. There were stretches of time when Brian supposedly took out-of-town jobs, and during those periods, Emily never showed up at school. Nobody questioned it because they always came with excuses. Flu season. Family emergency. Homeschooling temporarily. The lies were thin, but they were believable, and no one ever pushed further. That's how evil survives. It hides behind politeness, behind the facade of normalcy, behind the assumption that people couldn't possibly be that cruel. That's what made everything so much harder to process. Because the signs weren't on the surface. They were underneath, in the silences, in the routines, in the way Emily flinched when someone raised their voice too quickly or dropped something on the floor too loud. At home, Emily lived with two people who, by all accounts, looked like model parents. Her father, Brian, was a well-liked contractor who did free work for local churches and attended PTA meetings like clockwork. He even coached the town's Little League team for a few years. That illusion shattered the moment they started pulling back the layers of Emily's recent life. Her school records showed consistent attendance. She had no history of injuries, no behavioral flags. Teachers even described her as quiet but polite, the kind of child who followed the rules, stayed under the radar, and never caused a scene. As they interviewed family friends and distant relatives, a strange pattern started to emerge. There was an uncle who hadn't spoken to Brian in years but refused to say why. A former babysitter who abruptly stopped coming over and blocked Teresa's number. a neighbor who remembered seeing Emily sitting alone in the backyard at odd hours of the night, but brushed it off as quirky parenting. Piece by piece, those fragments formed a disturbing puzzle. Still, something didn't quite sit right with investigators. If Brian and Teresa were the masterminds, why were there signs of a larger operation? The basement room had equipment too sophisticated for an average household. The hard drives were encrypted with software far beyond what a local contractor would be familiar with. There were names mentioned in the diaries that didn't match anyone in the immediate family. And then there was the second house, a remote cabin property in a neighboring county, recently purchased under a shell company. Its utilities were paid in cash, and no one in town had even heard of it. The detectives knew they were circling something bigger than a simple domestic abuse case. Emily's drawings became a roadmap, and her interviews, while vague, hinted at more victims, other children, other rooms. But every time they tried to press for more, she'd shut down, withdraw, switch the topic. She was too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, but she was old enough to know that some things weren't safe to talk about.
Not yet.
Meanwhile, as the investigation expanded, media outlets began picking up the story. Terms like child abuse ring, hidden dungeon, and suburban horror started trending across platforms. Online forums lit up with theories, many of them outrageous, some chillingly close to the truth. The public's obsession grew, but so did the stakes. Because the more attention the case received, the more it endangered those involved, especially Emily. The real twist began to take shape when police traced one of the emails found in the encrypted files back to a local school therapist. Her name was Julia Marks, and she'd worked briefly with Emily during a 6-week pilot program funded by the district. When confronted, Julia was visibly shaken. She admitted to sensing something off during her sessions with Emily, drawing themes that made her uneasy, descriptions of games played at home that felt wrong, but she chalked it up to trauma from a past experience. She filed a mandatory report, but it was buried in paperwork and never followed up. Julia, racked with guilt, provided details that led to yet another unsettling discovery. Emily wasn't the first child she'd worked with who spoke in riddles about the quiet room. That's when detectives started revisiting older cases, missing children reports, families that moved away suddenly, unexplained school withdrawals. Patterns emerged, names resurfaced. And with each new connection, the scope of the crime expanded. But with every answer came more questions. Who else was involved? Was there someone in law enforcement tipping them off? Why were some files corrupted or missing altogether? And then, there's the biggest question of all. Who was the man Emily called the Watcher? She'd mentioned him only once in passing, as someone who came to check on the bad kids when they misbehaved. He wasn't her father. He wasn't her uncle. He was someone else entirely. A shadow figure who, according to her, had a special key no one else did. Police ran voice recognition against surveillance audio and came up empty. No matches in the system. No prior arrests. No digital footprint. Just a cold presence that hovered over the case like a ghost. And while it was easy to assume he was just part of her imagination, a defense mechanism, perhaps, the things she described were too precise to be fabricated. As the walls closed in around the investigation, and more people came forward with stories of strange encounters and buried suspicions, the detectives found themselves facing a dilemma: move quickly and risk alerting those still involved, or wait and risk losing the trail altogether. And while some officers argued to pull the trigger, others believed they were missing a key piece, something that would connect all the dots. The pressure from the public grew, amplified by viral TikTok theories, late-night news coverage, and influencers jumping on the story for clout. But behind the noise, behind the trending hashtags and YouTube shorts, one truth remained. The only person who really knew the full story was a child who had already seen too much and might not live long enough to tell the rest if the wrong people found out she had started talking. And then, just as the case seemed to reach a dead end, Emily made another quiet comment, this time while coloring during a supervised session. She mentioned a game they played in the other house. A game that involved numbers, wires, and something she called the red button. When asked about it, she shrugged and said, "You press it, and then the lights go out." But if you press it too many times, someone disappears. The room fell silent. The therapist froze. Because just a week prior, one of the detectives assigned to the case had mysteriously gone missing during a solo trip to the second property. And the last photo found on his phone, still unsent in his gallery, showed something almost unbelievable: wires, a panel, and a red button. The question now wasn't whether the girl had seen too much. It was whether she'd already said too much. As Emily's comment about the red button sent chills through the investigation team, it also set off a new series of alarms within the police department. Her mother, Teresa, ran a home-based baking business and was known for donating cookies during school fundraisers. To neighbors, they were kind, generous, always smiling. But in hindsight, those smiles were too perfect, too forced. When the police began digging into their lives, what they found didn't add up. Financial records were off. There were stretches of time when Brian supposedly took out-of-town jobs, and during those periods, Emily never showed up at school. Nobody questioned it because they always came with excuses. Flu season. Family emergency. Homeschooling temporarily. The lies were thin, but they were believable, and no one ever pushed further. That's how evil survives. It hides behind politeness, behind the facade of normalcy, behind the assumption that people couldn't possibly be that cruel. That's what made everything so much harder to process. Because the signs weren't on the surface. They were underneath, in the silences, in the routines, in the way Emily flinched when someone raised their voice too quickly or dropped something on the floor too loud. At home, Emily lived with two people who, by all accounts, looked like model parents. Her father, Brian, was a well-liked contractor who did free work for local churches and attended PTA meetings like clockwork. He even coached the town's Little League team for a few years. That illusion shattered the moment they started pulling back the layers of Emily's recent life. Her school records showed consistent attendance. She had no history of injuries, no behavioral flags. Teachers even described her as quiet but polite, the kind of child who followed the rules, stayed under the radar, and never caused a scene.
Al.
As they interviewed family, friends, and distant relatives, a strange pattern started to emerge. There was an uncle who hadn't spoken to Brian in years but refused to say why. A former babysitter who abruptly stopped coming over and blocked Teresa's number. A neighbor who remembered seeing Emily sitting alone in the backyard at odd hours of the night, but brushed it off as quirky parenting. Piece by piece, those fragments formed a disturbing puzzle. Still, something didn't quite sit right with investigators. If Brian and Teresa were the masterminds, why were there signs of a larger operation? The basement room had equipment too sophisticated for an average household. The hard drives were encrypted with software far beyond what a local contractor would be familiar with. There were names mentioned in the diaries that didn't match anyone in the immediate family. And then there was the second house, a remote cabin property in a neighboring county, recently purchased under a shell company. Its utilities were paid in cash, and no one in town had even heard of it. The detectives knew they were circling something bigger than a simple domestic abuse case. Emily's drawings became a roadmap, and her interviews, while vague, hinted at more victims, other children, other rooms. But every time they tried to press for more, she'd shut down, withdraw, switch the topic. She was too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, but she was old enough to know that some things weren't safe to talk about.
Not yet.
Meanwhile, as the investigation expanded, media outlets began picking up the story. Terms like child abuse ring, hidden dungeon, and suburban horror started trending across platforms. Online forums lit up with theories, many of them outrageous, some chillingly close to the truth. The public's obsession grew, but so did the stakes. Because the more attention the case received, the more it endangered those involved, especially Emily. The real twist began to take shape when police traced one of the emails found in the encrypted files back to a local school therapist. Her name was Julia Marks, and she'd worked briefly with Emily during a 6-week pilot program funded by the district. When confronted, Julia was visibly shaken. She admitted to sensing something off during her sessions with Emily, drawing themes that made her uneasy, descriptions of games played at home that felt wrong, but She chalked it up to trauma from a past experience. She filed a mandatory report, but it was buried in paperwork and never followed up. Julia, racked with guilt, provided details that led to yet another unsettling discovery. Emily wasn't the first child she'd worked with who spoke in riddles about the quiet room. That's when detectives started revisiting older cases, missing children reports, families that moved away suddenly, unexplained school withdrawals. Patterns emerged, names resurfaced. And with each new connection, the scope of the crime expanded. But with every answer came more questions. Who else was involved? Was there someone in law enforcement tipping them off? Why were some files corrupted or missing altogether? And then, there's the biggest question of all. Who is the man Emily called the Watcher? She'd mentioned him only once in passing, as someone who came to check on the bad kids when they misbehaved. He wasn't her father. He wasn't her uncle. He was someone else entirely. A shadow figure who, according to her, had a special key no one else did. Police ran voice recognition against surveillance audio and came up empty. No matches in the system. No prior arrests. No digital footprint. Just a cold presence that hovered over the case like a ghost. And while it was easy to assume he was just part of her imagination, a defense mechanism, perhaps, the things she described were too precise to be fabricated. As the walls closed in around the investigation, and more people came forward with stories of strange encounters and buried suspicions, the detectives found themselves facing a dilemma: move quickly and risk alerting those still involved, or wait and risk losing the trail altogether. And while some officers argued to pull the trigger, others believed they were missing a key piece, something that would connect all the dots. The pressure from the public grew, amplified by viral TikTok theories, late-night news coverage, and influencers jumping on the story for clout. But behind the noise, behind the trending hashtags and YouTube shorts, one truth remained. The only person who really knew the full story was a child who had already seen too much and might not live long enough to tell the rest if the wrong people found out she had started talking. And then, just as the case seemed to reach a dead end, Emily made another quiet comment, this time while coloring during a supervised session. She mentioned a game they played in the other house. A game that involved numbers, wires, and something she called the red button. When asked about it, she shrugged and said, "You press it, and then the lights go out. But if you press it too many times, someone disappears." The room fell silent. The therapist froze. Because just a week prior, one of the detectives assigned to the case had mysteriously gone missing during a solo trip to the second property. And the last photo found on his phone, still unsent in his gallery, showed something almost unbelievable: wires, a panel, and a red button. The question now wasn't whether the girl had seen too much. It was whether she'd already said too much. As Emily's comment about the red button sent chills through the investigation team, it also set off a new series of alarms within the police department. The case had already drawn attention from the public and media outlets, pushing for answers at a rate that made their heads spin. Now, just as they were getting close to uncovering something monumental, the very evidence they needed slipped away. And there was no telling how far those behind the scenes would go to keep the truth hidden. While everyone scrambled to figure out what had happened, an unexpected source of help emerged. Officer Rebecca Haynes, a new recruit who had been shadowing the team for only a few weeks, seemed eager to help, offering ideas and potential leads. At first, she appeared to be a breath of fresh air in a case that had quickly become tainted with distrust and dead ends. She even helped push forward some of the investigations into the second property, the cabin, by following up on potential witnesses who had claimed to have seen suspicious activity. Rebecca's energy and drive were infectious, and she quickly became the team's go-to person for chasing down new leads. But soon, her presence began to feel unsettling. Small inconsistencies started to surface in her story. It vanished completely. There were no explanations, no technical glitches, just a strange, unnerving silence when the lead investigator tried to retrieve it. A computer error? A glitch in the system? Maybe. But deep down, everyone knew this wasn't a simple malfunction. Someone had made sure it disappeared. The frustration among the team was palpable. It was eerily reminiscent of the details Emily had mentioned in passing. Everyone thought they were on the verge of a breakthrough. But in the world of high-stakes investigations, things don't always go as planned. Hours after the photo surfaced in the detective's files, the photo taken by the missing detective, which had been uploaded to the cloud, was an instant source of fascination. It showed a room, dimly lit, with old-fashioned electrical equipment and, most disturbingly, a single, glaring red button. One night, while going through old case files in the police station, she had claimed to have received a call from an anonymous tipster about a potential new suspect. But when asked for the phone number or any details about the call, she couldn't provide anything concrete. It didn't take long for someone to realize that Rebecca had no contact records of that call in her phone, something that should have been there. A call from an anonymous tipster in a high-profile case like this? It should have left some trace, even if it was just a block number. When questioned further, she became defensive, brushing off the concerns and insisting that she'd been busy with field work and hadn't had time to document it properly. But the unease didn't go away. And the closer the team looked at her, the more cracks began to appear in the seemingly perfect image she'd cultivated. At the same time, another odd development took place. Emily, the child at the center of it all, seemed to slip further into herself. Despite her earlier breakthroughs, she had stopped talking. The once innocent girl who had described the red button in her quiet voice was now avoiding eye contact, refusing to draw, and even hiding under the table during therapy sessions. She had become a ghost of the child they'd met just days before. It was as though a shadow had descended over her. Emily's behavior grew even more erratic, and her mother, Teresa, began showing up more frequently, her demeanor shifting from calm to coldly protective. Teresa, who had once been willing to cooperate with investigators, now kept her daughter at arm's length, refusing to answer questions or allow Emily to speak with anyone in private. It was almost as if Teresa knew exactly what her daughter had seen, and she wasn't about to let the truth slip out, at any cost. But it wasn't just Teresa who had become more secretive. When investigators began digging deeper into the family's past, they uncovered a chilling fact. Brian, Emily's father, had a history of violent outbursts that had been carefully hidden from the public. Years before the family moved to this small town, Brian had been arrested for assaulting a former business partner. The charges were mysteriously dropped after the partner, who had been a key witness, disappeared without a trace. It was a dark chapter in his past that no one had ever known about, and it raised a whole new set of questions. Had Brian's violent tendencies simply been buried under a veneer of charm, or was there something more to his actions that no one was willing to confront? And if so, what had happened to that business partner? Could there be a link between his disappearance and the disturbing events surrounding Emily now? As the investigation seemed to stall and the leads began to dry up, Emily's situation became more pressing. Her teachers had noticed that she hadn't been herself in school lately, often staring blankly at the walls or muttering things under her breath. And when they attempted to approach her, Emily would close off completely, retreating into her shell as though a protective barrier had been raised around her mind. It wasn't clear if this was a reaction to the trauma she had experienced, or if someone or something was forcing her into silence. The closer the police got to unraveling the dark truth, the tighter the grip on Emily seemed to become. It was as though her very existence was under threat, not only from the sinister forces she had once trusted, but also from those she thought were there to protect her. In a desperate attempt to push past the walls Emily had built, the detectives decided to press harder, to go straight to the heart of the family's darkest secrets. But what they discovered next was far beyond anything they had expected. A final, terrifying revelation came from an unexpected source, a former friend of Brian's who had left town years ago but had stayed in contact with a few local acquaintances. When she came forward, her story seemed almost too unbelievable. According to her, she had once seen a room inside the house, the very same house Emily had lived in, that was hidden behind a false wall. And within that room, there was a collection of items, tools, strange devices, and objects that made no sense. The most chilling part of her account? She claimed that the room was called the Keeper's Room, and it wasn't just for show. It was used for something much darker, something that even she couldn't bring herself to describe fully. But before the detectives could follow up on this new lead, something strange happened. The woman who had come forward suddenly disappeared. There were no signs of a struggle, no messages, no clues as to where she had gone. The only thing left behind was a cryptic message sent to one of the officers' phones, written in the form of an anonymous text: "Stop digging or you'll lose more than just the case." Now, the detectives were faced with an impossible choice. Do they push forward and risk exposing a dangerous conspiracy, or do they pull back and let the truth remain buried forever? The stakes had never been higher, and yet with every new piece of evidence, the danger only seemed to escalate. The chilling question remained: who was pulling the strings behind the scenes, and what was the true cost of uncovering the truth? And with Emily's silence growing more oppressive by the day, time was running out. The investigation seemed to be slipping into chaos. An unexpected twist brought even more confusion and suspicion into the mix. One evening, she showed up unannounced at the police station, her face pale and drawn. She demanded to speak with Detective Harris, the lead investigator, but her request was so urgent, so frantic, that it set alarm bells ringing in his mind. When he finally agreed to meet with her, Teresa seemed almost desperate, her words tumbling out in a rush as she tried to explain herself. "It's all connected, don't you see?" she said, her eyes wide with fear. "The room, the things you found, the message Emily gave you, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. They promised me they'd leave us alone." The detective's suspicion deepened as he listened to Teresa's rambling account, trying to make sense of her fragmented words. She spoke in riddles, as though afraid that someone might overhear her. She mentioned a past event, one that she insisted had been buried for good, that tied back to the mysterious red button and the strange room. But when he pressed her for more details, she fell silent, shaking her head as though she had crossed some invisible line by even speaking of it. She seemed to know more than she was letting on, but the fear in her eyes made it impossible for him to push her further. Whatever was going on, Teresa was terrified, and it wasn't just the threat of the unknown. It was the chilling knowledge that someone out there had the power to destroy everything she cared about, including her own daughter. As the weeks wore on, it became clear that something much darker than anyone had initially believed was unfolding. Rebecca Haynes, the eager officer who had been a constant presence throughout the case, had received a similar message to the one sent to the detective who had been investigating the missing woman. This time, the message was addressed directly to Rebecca, and it was chilling in its simplicity. "You're getting too close. Stop or face the consequences." No number to trace, no sender. Just the cold, threatening words that echoed in Rebecca's mind long after she read them. For a brief moment, Rebecca considered reporting it, but her instincts told her not to. Something about the timing felt too deliberate. She couldn't shake the feeling that the message wasn't just a random threat. It was a calculated move meant to manipulate her, to push her out of the investigation and stop her from uncovering whatever dark secrets were lurking in the shadows. But who would go to such lengths to silence her? Was she really in danger, or was she just overreacting to the mounting pressure? As the tension mounted, Rebecca found herself questioning her own place in the investigation. Could she trust the people she had been working alongside? Or were they all part of something far more sinister than she could ever have imagined? Meanwhile, Teresa, Emily's mother, had begun acting more erratically. As the investigation into the family deepened, it became clear that Teresa was hiding something, and it wasn't just her protective instincts towards Emily. The detectives, who were already stretched thin trying to make sense of the hidden room and the cryptic disappearance of the woman who had come forward, were caught off guard by a sudden development that no one had anticipated. The mysterious forces at play, the hidden room, the cryptic threats, and the chilling silences all pointed to a far-reaching conspiracy that involved people no one had ever suspected. But who could they trust? Were the people close to the investigation truly on their side, or was there someone lurking in the shadows, manipulating the situation to their advantage? Detective Harris found himself questioning everyone, his colleagues, the new recruits, and even Emily's family. He began to suspect that the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Then, Just when the detectives thought they had reached a dead end, they stumbled across a startling piece of evidence, an old police report, long buried in the archives, that contradicted everything they thought they knew about the case. It was dated back several years and involved a suspicious fire at a local warehouse, one that had never been properly investigated. The report contained a name that immediately rang alarm bells in Harris's mind: Brian, Emily's father. The connection was vague at first, but as they dug deeper, they uncovered that the fire had been set intentionally and that Brian had been involved in some way. But what was his role? Was he the one responsible for starting the fire, or was he somehow being framed? The answers seemed just out of reach, and with every new twist, the investigation seemed to spiral further into uncertainty. As the pieces of the puzzle began to shift, so did the stakes. More threats began to surface, this time directed not only at the investigators, but at their families. Detective Harris received an anonymous letter warning him to stay away from the case or face dire consequences. It was signed with the same chilling phrase that had appeared in the previous messages: "You're getting too close. Stop or face the consequences." The letter was waiting for him on his desk one morning, as though it had appeared overnight, and its presence made him question just how far the conspiracy reached. Were these threats a mere scare tactic, or was someone really watching his every move? He couldn't tell anymore, and it was beginning to take a toll on him. But the most disturbing twist of all came when Rebecca, who had been quietly investigating in her spare time, found something that sent a shiver down her spine. She had been looking into old case files from years past, trying to connect the dots between Brian's past and the current investigation, when she stumbled across a chilling detail. It was a connection between Brian and a well-known local figure, a figure who had always been considered above suspicion. This person was connected to the original police report regarding the fire, but their involvement had never been disclosed before. The revelation was enough to make Rebecca's blood run cold. Had they been under surveillance all along? Had someone known about their every move from the very beginning? The questions now seemed endless, and the tension was palpable. Who could they trust? Was Brian really the key to unlocking the mystery, or was he just another pawn in a much larger game? The answers remained frustratingly out of reach, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Every lead seemed to pull them into a new web of lies, secrets, and betrayal, and with each new discovery, the stakes grew higher. The detectives were caught in a race against time, but with every step forward, it felt like they were being pulled further into the darkness, and the danger of uncovering the truth was becoming more real than ever. And just when it seemed like they were on the verge of cracking the case wide open, something happened that no one could have predicted, a twist that would send everything spiraling out of control. The shocking revelation came in the form of a single phone call, the details of which were enough to change the course of the entire investigation. But what was said in that call? And who was on the other end? You'll have to keep watching to find out. The building was empty. It was after hours, and only a few of his colleagues remained. When he stood up to investigate, there was no one in sight, and the hallway was eerily quiet. But the feeling of being watched intensified, suffocating him, as if every corner held something or someone waiting to strike. It was then that Harris realized this wasn't just paranoia. Someone was following him, someone who knew exactly what he was doing, who was always a step ahead, pulling the strings. The next morning, things took a darker turn. His partner, Rebecca, had gone missing. She had been working late the night before, combing through a pile of evidence she had gathered, trying to link the recent developments to the past. She had been exhausted, but determined, and had texted Harris just hours before her disappearance to confirm their next move. But when he tried to reach her the following morning, her phone went straight to voicemail. No response, no explanation. Just silence. Panic set in as he realized Rebecca had vanished without a trace, and it didn't take long for the rest of the team to feel the weight of the situation. Something had gone horribly wrong. The case they had been investigating was no longer just a matter of exposing a criminal. It had turned into a battle for survival. The absence of Rebecca didn't just feel like a missing person case. It felt like a warning. Was she taken to send a message? Was she in danger because of what she had uncovered? Harris's mind raced with 1,000 questions, But there was one that kept coming back to him. Who could he trust? His thoughts were clouded with doubt, and every person he spoke to, every lead he followed, felt like it was part of a much larger, more dangerous game. The more he tried to unravel the mystery, the more it seemed to pull him deeper into an abyss that threatened to swallow everything. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't back down now, not when they were so close, not when Rebecca was missing, not when so many lives were on the line. The further Harris pushed, the more desperate things became. The investigation had already become far more complicated than anyone could have imagined, but what happened next pushed everything into a terrifying new reality. Detective Harris, who had been growing increasingly paranoid, couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It started with the little things. An unfamiliar car parked down the street, its engine running late at night, the shadow that moved in his peripheral vision while walking home, the sudden, unsettling silence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. At first, he brushed it off as stress, the product of working endless hours on a case that was consuming him. But it wasn't long before the feeling became undeniable, and the fear began to settle deep in his gut. Late one evening, as he sat alone in his office, staring at a stack of files that seemed to grow larger by the day, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. He found his own safety slipping through his fingers as strange things began happening to him. His personal belongings were moved, his car was tampered with, and anonymous messages filled his inbox, warning him to stop investigating, warning him to leave the case alone. Each threat was more direct than the last, but it wasn't until a chilling phone call that he fully realized the extent of the danger he was in. The voice on the other end was distorted, purposefully altered to hide any trace of the person behind it. But there was no mistaking the cold, menacing tone that sent a shiver through his spine. "You think you're close, don't you? You're wrong. You don't know who you're messing with." The line went dead before Harris could respond. That was the moment he realized this wasn't just a case. It was personal. Someone was watching him, someone who would do anything to keep the truth buried, no matter the cost. As Harris raced to find Rebecca, he began to fear the worst. Was she still alive? Was she being used as leverage to stop him? He thought about the people close to him, the ones who had always been by his side.
Could one of them be involved?
The thought was unbearable. He had always trusted his team, had always believed in their loyalty. But now, every glance, every word, every gesture seemed laden with suspicion. Were they all in on it? Or was someone else pulling the strings, manipulating the situation from behind the scenes? Harris couldn't tell anymore, and that uncertainty gnawed at him, making it harder to focus on the case, harder to stay grounded. The days turned into a blur of sleepless nights and frantic searching. The pressure of the case weighed heavily on him, but nothing compared to the fear that kept creeping into his mind. The fear that no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many leads he followed, he would never be able to stop whatever was coming next. Harris's paranoia reached a boiling point when he discovered something that made his blood run cold. An old photograph, one that had been buried in the case files for years, but had never been brought up before. It was a picture of a man, one that looked eerily familiar, standing alongside Emily's father, Brian. They were standing outside a rundown building, arms around each other, smiling like old friends. But what stood out more than the photograph itself was the date on the back of it. April 13th, 2005. The day before the fire. The day before everything had gone wrong. The man in the photo looked like someone he had seen before, but where? The answer lingered just out of reach, taunting him, as though the truth was slipping through his fingers. Harris felt the walls closing in on him. The evidence he had gathered over the past few weeks seemed to be leading him in circles, and every time he thought he was getting closer, a new obstacle appeared, pushing him further away from the truth. But there was no going back now. Too many people were involved, too many lives were at stake. The danger was real, and it was coming for him. The stakes had never been higher. Every moment felt like a countdown, and Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. As he walked out of his office late that night, he noticed something unusual, a shadow lingering just beyond the parking lot, a figure standing motionless, watching him. When he turned around, The figure was gone. He was being hunted, and there was no way out. The investigation had become something far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined, and as he felt the weight of it all, he realized that the answers might come at a much higher cost than he was willing to pay. What would it take to uncover the truth? Would he be able to find Rebecca before it was too late? Or would he fall victim to the same darkness that had consumed so many others? The question still remained, but one thing was certain. The danger was far from over. And it was only just beginning. Just when Detective Harris thought he had reached the deepest point of the investigation, something happened that would shatter everything he believed to be true. The twists had been relentless, and the danger felt suffocating, but nothing could have prepared him for the discovery that lay just around the corner, something that would change everything, forcing him to question every move he'd made up until that moment. The warehouse was dark and eerily quiet. His footsteps echoed off the walls as he made his way inside, trying to stay alert, eyes darting to every corner. It was the kind of place that felt abandoned, forgotten by time, but there was something about it, something that tugged at his instincts. His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of true fear. As he ventured deeper into the building, he noticed something strange. The floor was covered with scattered papers, old files, and photographs, some of them burned at the edges, as though they had been hastily discarded. But one picture in particular caught his eye, tucked beneath a pile of old newspapers, and when he lifted it up, his breath caught in his throat. The image showed Emily, the girl at the center of it all. It started innocuously enough, one of the few remaining leads he had been following, an anonymous tip that had led him to a seemingly unrelated warehouse at the edge of town. But as he entered the building, a sudden realization hit him. This wasn't just another dead end. This was where everything had started to unravel. Standing next to a man Harris had never seen before, but what struck him immediately was the expression on her face. There was something in her eyes, something that suggested more than just innocence. It was a look of guilt, of knowing something she shouldn't have. But it wasn't just her face that shocked him. It was the man beside her. The man, whose face was partially obscured, but whose familiar features made Harris's stomach turn. It was someone close to him, someone he had trusted. Someone he had known for years. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. It was Brian, Emily's father. Brian had been a part of the investigation from the very beginning, and Harris had never once suspected him of being involved in anything sinister. He had assumed Brian was simply a victim of circumstance, caught up in the horrific events surrounding his daughter. But now, as he stared at the photo, everything began to fall into place. The fire, the strange behavior, the way Brian had always seemed to be one step ahead. Harris couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The man who had been at the center of it all, the one he had trusted, was more deeply involved than he could have ever imagined. But just as the pieces started to fit together, Harris received a shocking message that took the investigation in an entirely new direction. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was short, cryptic, and chilling. The truth isn't what you think. Brian's not the only one hiding something. Look deeper, and you'll see who's really been pulling the strings. Harris stood there for a moment, staring at the message, his mind racing. It felt like a warning, a final push to dig deeper, to uncover something that was being kept hidden just out of reach. But who was this new person? Was it someone trying to mislead him, or someone who was genuinely trying to help him uncover the truth? The more Harris tried to make sense of it all, the more everything seemed to spiral out of control. He thought he was getting closer to the truth, but now it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, like the very foundation of the investigation was built on lies. He couldn't trust anyone, not even himself. The uncertainty weighed on him heavily, and he knew that whatever came next, it would be more dangerous than anything he had faced so far. He needed answers, but every time he thought he was getting closer, another twist emerged, sending him in a new direction. And as he looked down at the photo of Emily and Brian, he realized the biggest question of all. Was Emily just a pawn in a much larger game? Or had she known more than she let on? The thought was unbearable, but as Harris thought back to all the moments that had seemed odd or out of place, the truth became undeniable. Someone had been manipulating everything from the shadows. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but as the mystery deepened, so did the danger. Harris was no longer just chasing a criminal. He was up against a force, a network of people who had been operating in the dark for years. His life, and everyone else's, was at the mercy of whoever was orchestrating this twisted plot. The stakes were higher than ever, and every answer only led to more questions. The final twist was still to come, but Harris knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just fighting to solve a case. He was fighting to survive. And the closer he got to the truth, the more he realized that no one was safe, least of all him. The truth came crashing down like a wave of cold, hard reality. Detective Harris had thought he was playing the game, following the breadcrumbs, connecting the dots. But now, as the final pieces began to fall into place, he realized that everything he had believed, everything he had worked for, was a lie. The conspiracy was far deeper, far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And it wasn't just about Emily anymore. It wasn't just about one missing girl, one broken family. This went far beyond that. Far beyond what he was prepared for. The warehouse, the place where it all started, was no longer just a lead. It was the center of a sprawling, insidious network that stretched far and wide. What Harris had thought were isolated incidents, minor players, were now revealed to be part of a larger operation, one that had been pulling strings behind the scenes for years. As he dug deeper, more faces appeared, names he'd heard before but never questioned. The more he uncovered, the more the walls seemed to close in around him. The conspiracy was everywhere, woven into the fabric of the city, of the people he had trusted. But the most crushing blow came when Harris returned to the precinct late one night, desperate for answers, only to find that his own partner, Officer Sarah Bennett, had been working against him all along. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She had been with him from the beginning, offering support, helping him follow the case, standing by his side when the pressure got unbearable. But now, with the truth finally exposed, he saw her for what she truly was, a key player in the operation he had spent so long trying to dismantle. She had been feeding information to the other side, keeping tabs on his every move, manipulating the investigation from within. His mind raced as he replayed every conversation, every moment he had spent with her, looking for the signs he had missed. It was all there, small things, things he had brushed aside, never thinking they meant anything. The way she always seemed to have just the right information at the right time, the way she had subtly pushed him toward certain conclusions. It had all been calculated, part of a larger scheme to make sure Harris never uncovered the truth. His heart pounded as he stood there, the weight of betrayal crushing him. He had trusted Sarah. Hell, he had confided in her, shared his darkest fears and doubts, and now he realized it had all been a game to her. She wasn't just a pawn in this conspiracy. She was a mastermind, working from the inside, using Harris's own trust against him. The realization made his blood run cold. He had no idea who he could trust anymore. No one was who they seemed to be. The walls were closing in faster than he could process. But just as Harris began to gather his thoughts, his phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a new message. It's too late. They know you're onto them. Get out now, or they'll come for you next. The conspiracy was everywhere, and now it wasn't just about finding answers, it was about survival. The longer he stayed in the game, the closer the danger came, and the more uncertain the outcome became. He had no idea who was on his side, who was an enemy. But what he did know was that Emily's disappearance was only the beginning of something much bigger, something far darker than anyone could have anticipated. He couldn't stop now. He couldn't back down. But the closer he got to the heart of the conspiracy, the more his world unraveled. The stakes had never been higher. It wasn't just his career or his life on the line anymore. It was everything. The entire city had been affected, and those behind this web of lies were willing to do anything to protect their secrets. And as Harris looked over his shoulder, he realized that he was being watched, tracked at every turn. The conspiracy wasn't just in the shadows anymore. It was out in the open, and it was coming for him. His every instinct told him to run, to flee before it was too late, but he couldn't. Not when he was so close. But the moment he took a step forward, a car pulled up in front of him, its headlights blinding him, and for the first time, he realized that the price of uncovering the truth might be more than he was willing to pay. As he stepped toward the car, ready to face whatever awaited him, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was already 2 steps ahead, pulling the strings of his every move. The game was no longer in his control. And the real question was, would he survive long enough to expose the people who had been orchestrating this nightmare from the beginning? The message was from an unknown number, but the panic in its words was unmistakable. His mind reeled, his heart racing as he felt the pressure building from all sides. Whoever had sent the message was trying to warn him, but at what cost? If they were willing to expose the conspiracy, how deep did it go? Was Sarah a part of it all? Had she been working with someone else this whole time? Harris knew he didn't have much time. He had to act fast, but every move he made felt like a risk. Harris stood in the darkened alley, his breath heavy in the cold night air. The city around him was eerily quiet, but the weight of everything that had led him here felt like it was crashing down all at once. His mind was a storm of confusion and adrenaline, but one thing was clear. He was about to confront the person behind it all. Whoever had been orchestrating this twisted web of lies, betrayal, and manipulation, they were right in front of him now. The unknown number, the anonymous threats, it all led him here, to this very moment. There was no more running, no more distractions. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. As the headlights of the car dimmed, Harris stepped forward, his hands shaking but his resolve stronger than ever. He didn't know who he was about to face, but he knew they wouldn't let him walk away. He had already lost too much, his trust in those closest to him, his sense of safety, even his belief in the justice system that had once been his guiding light. Now, with every step he took, the lines blurred between right and wrong. Was he fighting for the truth, or was he just another pawn in a much larger game? The car door opened with a heavy creak, and out stepped a figure he hadn't expected, Sarah Bennett. His heart froze in his chest. The one person who he thought he could count on, the partner who had been with him from the start. She stood there, her face lit by the dim glow of the streetlights, her eyes cold and calculating. It was as though the woman he had known was gone, replaced by something far darker, far more dangerous. The last piece of the puzzle slid into place, and Harris felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The conspiracy, the manipulation, it wasn't just some faceless network. It was her. "You should have known better, Harris," Sarah said, her voice steady, almost pitying. "You really thought you could take them down? You've been chasing shadows this whole time." He could feel the weight of her words, but it was the look in her eyes that sent a chill down his spine. There was no remorse, no guilt. Just a calm assurance that she had already won. His mind raced, but no matter how much he tried to piece it together, the final motive eluded him. Why had she done it? What did she stand to gain? Sarah must have seen the confusion in his face because she smirked, as though she were savoring the moment. "The truth, Harris? The truth is, I've been playing both sides this whole time. You think I didn't know what you were up to? You think I didn't see you sniffing around, poking into things you shouldn't have? I let you chase your own tail while I stayed in the shadows, pulling the strings. You think you're the hero in this story? You're just a pawn, just like the rest of them." The words hit him like a slap. He had spent so long trusting her, thinking that she was his ally, his partner. But now, it all seemed like a game to her. She had been watching him, guiding him, manipulating him into believing that he was uncovering the truth when, in reality, she had already crafted the narrative. He had been led here, to this moment, to this confrontation, like a rat trapped in a cage. "You know," Sarah continued, her voice darkening, "you've already lost. The people behind this, they'll destroy you if you try to take them down. They'll make sure no one remembers your name." Her smile twisted into something sinister. "You were never supposed to find out. And now, you're just another loose end that needs to be tied up." Harris's pulse pounded in his ears. His every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of there before it was too late, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. He couldn't back down now. Not when he was so close, not when he had already come this far. He had to know. He had to understand why. Why, Sarah, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, hoarse with emotion. Why did you do this? Her eyes softened for just a moment, but it was a fleeting vulnerability. Because I had no choice, Harris, she said, almost too softly. Do you think I wanted to do this? Do you think I wanted to betray you? No, I didn't. But there are bigger forces at play here. Bigger than you. Bigger than me. She paused, as though the weight of her own words was sinking in. I didn't want this life, but I don't have a choice. The people I work for, they control everything. And now, they control me. Harris's mind reeled. The last threads of clarity slipped away as he tried to process her words. The conspiracy was real, bigger than he could have ever imagined, and Sarah was just one piece of it. He wasn't just fighting for Emily anymore. He was fighting for his life. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the people who had once been closest to him. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and a blinding light enveloped them both. Harris flinched, instinctively raising his hands to shield his eyes. When he lowered them, Sarah was gone. Disappeared. The car was still there, but the street was empty. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as panic surged through him. What had just happened? Where did she go? Was she just playing another trick? Or had someone else intervened? He turned frantically, looking for any sign of movement, but the alley remained eerily silent. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, and for the first time, Harris felt the weight of the entire conspiracy bearing down on him. The sense of being watched, of being hunted, was undeniable. He had lost sight of Sarah, but now he realized he wasn't just looking for her. He was looking for the truth that had eluded him for so long, and the truth that, no matter how much he wanted it, might just be more than he could handle. The final twist was this. There was no escaping this. The conspiracy wasn't just in the city. It wasn't just about Emily or Sarah. It had already infiltrated his life, his career, and even his mind. Whoever had orchestrated this whole thing had been steps ahead of him from the very start. Harris was no longer just a detective. He was a player in a game far beyond his control. And as he stood there, in the heart of that dark, empty alley, he knew that everything he thought he understood about the case, about the world around him, was nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. And the worst part was, he didn't know if he could trust anything or anyone ever again. Weeks passed since that night in the alley, but for Harris, time had lost its meaning. The shadows that once seemed to lurk around every corner had now faded, replaced by the empty weight of a life that had been irrevocably changed. His investigation, his pursuit of the truth, had led him to places no one could have predicted, and while the conspiracy he'd unearthed had been both vast and twisted, there was one thing Harris knew for certain. His journey was far from over. The events he had uncovered, the betrayals, the manipulations, they all pointed to something much larger than he could have ever imagined. But in the quiet moments, when he allowed himself to reflect, he realized that perhaps the answers he had been seeking were never meant to be found. Maybe it wasn't about the truth. Maybe it was about survival. He sat alone in his apartment one late evening, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the room. His thoughts wandered back to Sarah. Her betrayal had been the knife that cut the deepest, but in the aftermath, he found himself asking more questions than he'd ever had before. The conspiracy hadn't died with her disappearance. If anything, it had only evolved. She was a part of something bigger, something that had quietly weaved itself into the very fabric of his life. And despite all his efforts to expose it, the forces behind the conspiracy remained untouchable, lurking just beyond the reach of justice. But there was one thing Harris hadn't expected: peace. It came slowly, like the dawning of a new day after the storm had passed. It wasn't the peace of closure, not exactly. It was more like the acceptance that some truths were too dangerous to bear, and some battles too costly to win. As he sat there, his mind processing the layers of lies, his fingers lightly brushed the edge of a letter on the table, a letter he hadn't opened yet. It was from an old colleague, someone he hadn't seen or spoken to in years. The letter felt heavier than it should. There was no return address, no signature, just a simple message. You know what you need to do. Trust no one, not even yourself. He let the words sink in. The world he had once trusted, the systems he had relied on, had been shattered. But the message wasn't just a warning. It was a reminder. There would always be more. There would always be another shadow, another lie to uncover. The realization hit him hard. He had become part of a never-ending cycle, chasing after pieces of a puzzle that would never quite fit together. And maybe, just maybe, that was the true price of knowledge. The more you know, the less you can trust. The more you uncover, the more you lose. With a long sigh, Harris set the letter down, his fingers lingering over it for a moment before he stood up and walked to the window. The city stretched out before him, a sea of lights and shadows, each one representing another untold story, another mystery buried deep beneath the surface. It was all still out there, waiting. The conspiracy hadn't disappeared. It was still alive, breathing, evolving in ways he would never fully understand. And yet, for the first time in a long while, Harris didn't feel the burning need to chase after it anymore. He had seen enough to know that some things were better left alone. As the city hummed in the distance, he thought about Emily, about the innocent words that had set everything in motion. She was safe now, free from the darkness that had once threatened her, but even she could never truly escape the ripple effects of what had happened. The people they trusted, the ones who had once seemed so reliable, had turned out to be the very ones orchestrating the most horrific acts of manipulation. And though the battle against that unseen force might never end, Harris had made peace with the fact that it was no longer his fight to win. Some battles are not meant to be fought alone. But just as Harris turned away from the window, preparing to leave the tangled mess of his thoughts behind, something caught his eye. A figure, standing in the shadows across the street. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed someone watching him, but tonight felt different. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his instinct screamed at him to stay alert. Had they found him again? Had the conspiracy, the people behind it all, finally come for him? Or was this just another coincidence in a world where nothing was ever what it seemed? The figure moved, and in that moment, Harris knew there was no such thing as peace. Not for him, not for anyone caught in this web. No matter how far you ran, how many mysteries you solved, there would always be another layer, another twist to the story. And so, as he watched the figure disappear into the night, a chilling thought settled in his mind. This story, this fight, it would never truly be over. Not for him, and not for anyone who had dared to uncover the darkness lurking beneath the surface. The real question was, who would be left standing when the final chapter was written? And as the screen faded to black, the haunting realization lingered in the air. Some stories are never meant to end.